welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Lucy Knill is a newly branded CEO, but at what point on her journey did she become the great leader that she's proving to be? It could be nature, evident from her relentless, meticulous mindset throughout her time in the events industry. It could be nurture, from the role models that taught her radical collaboration and the value of the bigger picture. Whatever the balance, if you're a new CEO or a long-time CEO who might be set in their ways, Lucy's story might remind you of the skills that you'll need to see you through a crisis, empower your teams, and create something with purpose. Welcome. Delighted to have you on the show today, Lucy. Very excited to talk to you. I'm looking forward to hearing your story. Could you just spend a little minute or two just introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Lucy Knill. I'm CEO at Anthropy, and I don't feel that I have a particularly remarkable background. I grew up in Oxfordshire in a farmhouse with my parents and my brother, and I went to university in Northampton. I moved to London, and as like a lot of people, I suppose, I somewhat sort of fell into the career that I have through a series of events, none of which were pre-planned. And it was really, in my case, a case of working it out as we go along in terms of where do we want to be and where we end up. So I guess that's what we'll chat through.
Brilliant. And I mean, you're a relatively recent CEO, and I'd love to just get your thoughts, because I think as a new CEO, and it's all fresh in your mind, what sort of things have you learned in your early tenure as a CEO? How's it changed you, and what sort of learnings would you share with other potential people who are about to become chief executive, or they hope they will?
Yeah, I think for me, it's the adjustment that I've needed to make and the journey that I've needed to go on is one from management and control to a bigger picture and an empowering of other people. And I think that's the adjustment that I've had to make and the change that I've had to deal with. I think that the background and my career so far, which has largely been in the delivery of large scale events, is very detailed. It's very planned. Everything is meticulous. And you sort of have to be a bit of a control freak to be any good at it. And that's definitely me. And actually, that's not what's necessarily needed for the next part of my journey, which is more about empowering other people. And so I think for me, I've reflected a lot on the sponsors that I've had that have helped me get to where I've got to, and how I've learned everything I've learned, which has actually been through being given responsibility and just having to figure it out. And I'm now finding myself in the shifting in time, which puts me in that position and me in needing to do that for other people, what people have done for me. And that is trusting other people and giving them responsibility, because I had to learn on my feet. I have managed to talk myself into a series of roles in my time for which I was not qualified. I did not have the relevant experience. And I had to then think, oh my God, I've got this. How do I do it now? And I had to figure it out.
Brilliant. And I mean, if you go back to your early career, talk a little bit about some of the formative periods you had when you started up in business and some of the pivotal moments that have occurred on your journey.
So I grew up in Oxfordshire. I went to university to do psychology, had not a clue what I wanted to do for a career. I had always worked. As soon as I was able to, I got my driving license, because when you grow up in the countryside, that is absolutely, key to having any sort of independence. I got that within 2 months of turning 17, and I got out there and I had jobs as a waitress. I worked as a nursery nurse looking after little kids, any time in between school and university, I was working. So I always had that sort of drive, but I never had any idea what I wanted to do as a career. My careers advice at school was actually not to go to university. And the only thing I really knew that I liked when I was younger was, something to do with children. I was really interested in babies and young people. And they said, go and do a BTEC in nursery nursing and go and do that. And then I found out, this is going to show my age now, but I found out that that was an £8,000 a year salary to work as a nursery nurse at that point in time. And I thought, I'm not sure that that's the best careers advice that I could ever be given. And my parents said, nah, you probably don't want to do that. You probably want to go to university, keep your options open. So I did. But I got through a psychology degree with still no idea what I wanted to do. I moved to London just because I had friends that had done that and I still didn't know what to do. And I went along to a graduate recruitment assessment centre. And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I've no idea what I want to do, but what you do looks kind of fun. Can I come and work for you? And I managed to get a job with them in recruitment. So that was about as accidental as it can possibly be, really. And then they ended up getting me a job working in sales because that was what they did as a recruitment business. So my first job, which I fell into by accident, was working in sales. I was selling training courses to people. And in that time, I was really lucky, actually, because there was a much more senior sales chap who happened to be training to be an NLP coach. And he needed somebody to kind of test out his newly learned coaching skills on. And for some reason, I was selected to be his kind of mentee number one. He wanted somebody to experiment on. I suppose they thought in choosing me that it would catapult my sales ability and I would become a much better salesperson or whatever. That completely backfired on them because it was massively transformational for me. But what it actually led to was me deciding I don't want to do this job anymore. So sales is for me. So great experience for me, not so great for the business.
And what is NLP, just in case folks aren't aware?
Sorry. So neuro-linguistic programming. And this is a series of skills where the coach works with the mentee to understand, I suppose, a bit more about how the brain works. And for me, the massive learning that came from it was the subtleties around linguistic programming. And what I have taken from that, and I have remembered the whole of the rest of my life since, is the power of positive language. So to give an example, as a parent, your job is to keep your children safe, right? So you see parents all the time where the little kid is walking along the top of a wall and they say, don't look down, don't trip over, don't fall off the wall. In order for the human to process what's being said, they need to first think about falling off the wall and then think about don't, because that negative part comes afterwards. And lo and behold, the child will almost always fall off the wall because they had to think about falling off the wall before they could process the don't fall off the wall aspect. So if you flip that round and you tell the child instead to be careful, look up, you use positive language instead, lo and behold, that child is probably not going to fall off the wall. And it was those types of kind of tools and techniques that I was really lucky to be exposed to right in the beginning of my 20s, because I think that framing and that positioning has informed really everything ever since. So I'm very grateful to Johnny Bowder, if you happen to be listening. That was the coach that I had all those years ago.
Fantastic. And how did that translate into you thinking, I'm out of sales and I'm going to do something else?
Well, because part of that process and part of the coaching that he took me through was what sort of person are you? What are you good at? What do you want to do? And I realized that I wasn't really being particularly fulfilled as I was. And I looked around actually at the other departments in the business, and there was a corporate affairs department whose job it was to produce the magazine that the business did every month and run all the events. So they had a whole series of award ceremonies and things like that. And I looked at that department and I thought, that department looks fun. But it was a very small team. There was only 3 people. And I had absolutely zero relevant experience for going into that team. But I set my sights on it. And what the NLP coaching had taught me was the power of visualizing something and manifesting it and doing everything you possibly can to work towards that goal to then achieve that goal. So I had to work quite hard to get into this department because it was only 3 people and I had no relevant experience. So I had to make myself pretty visible to the boss of that department. And essentially what I learned was that to get anywhere, you've got to be clear about what you want and you've got to be persistent about it. And you have got to go the extra mile and it's not just going to necessarily fall in your lap. So I had to volunteer. I had to do things that were not part of my normal job, but knowing that I wanted to switch into this other department, I volunteered to work at events that they were doing. I volunteered to write articles for the magazine because I knew it was their responsibility to also produce the magazine. I had to befriend those people. I had to make it clear that I was enthusiastic and desperate to work in that area. So I had to work hard and I also had to be patient, which is not one of my top skills. And I just had to sort of keep banging that drum really. But I eventually got there actually on a second attempt because somebody left. I thought, here's my chance. I gave the job to somebody else. I was mortified. So I then had to bounce back and go, okay, I was close. I almost had it. And next time it's going to be me. And I had to keep going. I guess that probably took a year or something. It was not a quick thing, but yeah, I just had to keep going really.
And so that took you into events. And where did the world of events then take you?
Yeah. So I got into that job. I realized I didn't have any idea of how to do it. And I had to figure it out pretty quickly. I guess I soon learned that the devil was in the detail, and I soon learned what was kind of really important and how to make that job work. But I was learning fast and thinking on my feet at that point. And, since then, a career in events has taken me actually to all sorts of interesting places. So from that moment, I did that job for a few years, actually, but then I moved to a different organization where, again, I talked myself into a job that I was not particularly qualified for, but I really, really wanted it. And on this occasion, it was events all around the world. Now, as a child, I had never even been on an aeroplane and never flew anywhere with my parents. We holidayed in the UK or we drove to France a handful of times. And suddenly I was in a job where I was responsible for not just flying, but chartering planes and leading groups of 50 or 100 people through airports and through a chartered plane process and into another country. And I was responsible for their whole experience, while we were there. So we had 100 people on an incentive travel program, for example. It was my job to source all the hotels, all the dinners, or, every part of their journey, and be responsible not just for kind of operations and logistics, but for those people in, their safe travel, their timely travel, and making sure they had a good time and everything else. And I, through that job, it was great. I did a lot of crazy experiences. One that particularly sticks in my mind. We went to Iceland, and it involved me driving up a glacier by myself to get to a venue where we had an event. And I remember thinking at the time, this is pretty crazy because all of the guests that are part of this program that we're doing, they've got expert 4x4 coaches with them, instructors teaching them how to manage the vehicle for the conditions that we are, driving literally up a mountain glacier. Here I am completely by myself, pop the coordinates in and off I go, thinking this is madness. What else am I doing? I'm in the middle of nowhere. So it was very much, again, sort of, learn on the job, say yes to everything, take the responsibility, and then figure it out and, have the confidence that I can do this. And just because I haven't done it before doesn't mean I can't do it. So I think it was say yes to everything and grow in confidence while you're doing it. I think that's what I took from that. that and the importance of relationships, because when I got out to Iceland, I was actually doing that event for a colleague. I hadn't been involved in any of the planning of it. I didn't know any of the people. And so I had to learn pretty quickly that you needed to make good, solid relationships with the rest of the crew, with the driving instructors and the other people that were involved, because that was how we were going to get through this, several weeks of being on the road and these crazy conditions, and everything else is the rest of the people that you're on that journey with.
I mean, there's a clear pattern here of sort of driven, persuading people to take you on to do jobs you don't know how to do, and then figuring it out. Where did that tenacity and confidence come from?
Honestly, I have absolutely no idea. I can't pinpoint a moment. I guess it's a personality trait. I think it's an enthusiasm for wanting to get out there and experience stuff. This was not something that I kind of was set up for really in a way in my childhood, because we didn't travel the world. I wasn't exposed to lots of things. I was extremely lucky. I had a very sheltered, normal, I suppose, upbringing. There was no particular wild event. I had two loving parents. I went to a state school. It was a very, very ordinary childhood. So I don't know where it came from.
It's a debate we've had a couple of times on Pivot Points. Are leaders sort of born or made or both? But
interesting.
Yeah, listening to you talk, there's an inherent tenacity in you. That is it genetic? And you can tell you're shaping and managing your own destiny and grabbing life rather than waiting for life to come to you. I'm always fascinated. Where does that come from? And we've also talked about accidental leadership, people who never set out to be a chief executive, and yet they've ended up in that leadership role. And so, for any advice for sort of young people who are starting off in their careers, how do you get that drive and tenacity and into your psyche and not sit there waiting to be told what to do?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head exactly there with that last part. It's not about sitting and waiting for the instructions. It is difficult to figure out what you want to do, and that can take a bit of help. I was extremely lucky to have had that very early sort of coaching experience, but I also kept my eyes open and I looked around at not just the job I was in, but what did all the other departments do? What was everyone else up to? What were the options? Because in all honesty, I left school, I think as a lot of people do, with no real idea of anything like the breadth of jobs and careers and types of organizations that are out there in the real world. And same thing through university. I had not a clue what the options are really. And it was only by saying yes to something, just get a job in any company and then look around at what do the other departments do? What's everyone else up to? And try and see what you feel most excited about, really. You've got to aim to do something that you're going to get some sort of enjoyment out of, because you spend a lot of hours working. So keep your eyes open and look around for something that you think is going to be enjoyable as well as paying a salary.
Yeah. And I've always said to my kids, I don't give them much advice. I leave them to figure it out for themselves. But I've always said, try and find something that you love doing and then figure out how to make a living from it.
And then you'll never work a day in your life, right? As they say.
And it's magical if you can achieve that. I think it really is. And so you're in events. What was the next big pivot that sort of hit your life?
So that was many years, and I did lots of different types of events, from conferences to award dues to traveling the world on incentive programs, and I'd probably done the best part of 20 years in different sorts of events when COVID came into all of our lives in 2020. And suddenly my industry, the only thing I had ever really done, was quite literally made illegal overnight. So events were not allowed anymore.
That's a pivot.
And that was a big thing, because it was a real kind of, oh my God, I don't know how to do anything else. And I've spent all of these years, traveling and organizing these big groups and these, mass gatherings and things. And I can't do that anymore. What am I going to do now? And by this point, I had 2 small children and I was the breadwinner of the household. I could not have my salary. We wouldn't be able to have paid the mortgage if I didn't have my job. And yet my whole industry has just been made illegal overnight. What am I going to do? So I was working in an events agency at that point, and the vast majority of people were furloughed because there was no projects. There was nothing for them to do. And again, I think I was lucky. Maybe there was some part of skill involved, I don't know, but I actually was not one of the people that was furloughed. So I was one of only a handful of senior people in the business at that point in time who wasn't furloughed. And we had to figure out what to do with the business, with the people, with the clients. And, meanwhile, if you remember that summer of 2020, it was really hot, so I was working at home in literally, it was like 35 degrees in April. It was extraordinary that summer. My kids were not going to nursery and school anymore. They were in the paddling pool being very noisy outside. And there was me thinking, oh my goodness me, what are we going to do? So that was an interesting time because we had to pivot, literally. And actually that was the word that was used a lot at that point in time. And I'm sure you must have gone through something similar, Dave, but we all suddenly had to work out how to use Teams and how to have meetings that were online and how to keep the business going. How do we take an events world and make it run virtually? And I think in amongst all the stuff that was going on at that point in time, there was 2 memories that really stick in my mind through that. One of them was the sort of parallel universe with my, I think, 6 or 7-year-old son at that point in time, because he and I would sit in my makeshift home office that was one of the bedrooms, side by side on our laptops with our headphones in, and he dialed into school. And, he did his calls with his poor teacher who was attempting to keep, 30 of these kids entertained and educated. And then me sitting next to my little boy on my calls and, trying to keep this company going and trying to support colleagues who were worried and talk to clients and so on. And I think I'll always remember that quite fondly, actually, as a moment, because that you just don't ever have that, normally. So that was very sweet, but probably less relevant to what you're wanting from me here. The other thing that really sticks in my mind is a particular event that we did in that time where nobody was doing events. So there was a brief period, if you remember, in 2020, we had the first lockdown that went on for, I don't know, what was it, 4 or 5 months or something in the end? It was all over the summer from like March to the end of summer. Then we had a brief period in the autumn where we were not in lockdown, and then we all went back into lockdown again in the winter. And in that brief period where we were not in lockdown, I had one brave client who wanted to do an in-person event, and I was asked to do it. And that event, I think, will always stick in my mind because it was an automotive company who hadn't been able to do any of the car launch events that they would normally do. They hadn't been able to invite any journalists to come and drive any of their new products in order to then write about the cars, in order to then put that into the media. So they had a bit of a backlog, and they came and said, what do we do? And we had to pitch for it. We had to win it. And we put together an event for the journalists to come and drive these cars. Now, under ordinary circumstances, that in itself was nothing remarkable. I'd done events like that a lot. But what was remarkable was the conditions were obviously completely different. So every day we were looking at the news and the guidelines. Social distancing measures were changing. 1 meters became 2 meters. There was masks. There was all of these kind of rules and things that were changing all the time. There was the constant imminent, are we going back into lockdown tomorrow or on Saturday? Or, when is the next lockdown coming? So there was lots of practical things that we had to do. There was lots of budgetary considerations and all of that stuff. But the thing that really stuck in my mind from this particular event was what it meant to bring those humans together. And I remember we had taken a big aircraft hangar and we had fitted it out with all the stuff that we needed, and also then tried to make it, enticing and good for a live event. And on the night before we went live with the event, we were all standing in this aircraft hangar, and the grown men who were lighting engineers and, were driving the cherry pickers and the equipment that we needed and everything were quite literally in tears, right? And that was because they'd had no work for months. Livelihoods had gone on hold. The whole industry, as I said, was literally shut down overnight. Nobody had any money. Nobody knew when it was coming back. It was a scary time. And we had brought together that opportunity. So all of those suppliers and all the people that were involved in putting that event together were incredibly grateful and emotional. And then every single guest that we invited turned up. And these are automotive journalists. They normally really cherry pick, what they go to. And it's hard to get into the diaries of these people normally. Every single one of them turned up, and they were incredibly grateful. And they wanted the human connection. They wanted to be back together with other people. They wanted to be part of a live event again after months of being, locked down at home and with another lockdown imminent. And it really said to me, like, events are not just a marketing tool. They're actual human glue. This is our innate need to come together as people, and that is how we get through things. It put the world of events into a whole different perspective for me.
I mean, that's a fantastic story, and bringing people together is something that companies do all of the time, but you don't really probably see the meaning until you get something like that where you haven't been able to do it for 6 months, and they all come together. And probably a lot of the listeners don't realize that most of those people in that industry are self-employed.
Absolutely.
Therefore, they would have nothing literally for those 6 months. They wouldn't be. And I know the government didn't sort that out particularly quickly into how to look after freelancers and people who were self-employed.
Yeah, because there was no furlough option for those people.
No.
They literally had nothing overnight. And, with that is not just your money, but your dignity, your,
everything,
respect, everything.
Yeah. No, that's a brilliant learning. And, hopefully people listening will start to value the corporate events that they go on more and that human connection, because it's dead easy to forget COVID and what happened in that short period of time. So you come out of COVID. What sort of was the next pivot that happened in the journey of life?
Well, I think by that point, I've been doing 25 years in corporate events, and incredible as it was and everything that I had learned, I really was feeling a kind of very desperate urge by this point to be needing to do something more purposeful, and racking my brains as to how that was going to work. I had thought about, my first job was in a charity. Do I go back to working for a charity? How can I make sense of the skills that I've got and the experience that I've got? I can't go backwards and start again in a whole new career financially, because, as I say, I'm the breadwinner and I've got family and children and mortgage to support. So I needed to find some way of being able to make use of the experience that I had without going backwards to completely start it again. But how was I going to make that kind of purposeful? How was I going to feel that I was a bit more fulfilled, and how was I going to actually do some good in the world and make a difference, and not just be about, selling more products or whatever. And I was racking my brains as to how to do this. And I don't know if the universe was smiling on me or how I managed to get so lucky, but I was introduced through my boss at the time to a man called John O'Brien. And John was in the process of founding something called Anthropy. And John he'd had his own COVID journey, of course, as everybody has. And he had been thinking during that time about how can we build back better, to coin the phrase of that time, if people remember that phrase. he had born the concept of, we need to bring people together. We need to get the leaders of this country, be they from business, from charity, from academia, from politics. We need to convene people together to come and have a big conversation and put together a new vision for a brighter way forward, a better Britain. How can we work together and collaborate to achieve something different? And he had, at that point, he had been to talk to a chap called Sir Tim Smith, who's the founder of the Eden Project in Cornwall. And they had hatched a plan between them. And John had essentially managed to twist Tim's arm to say, could we use Eden Project as a venue to bring together leaders to look at, how can we form a better version of the vision for our future than the one we currently see? And my boss, who knew John through a connection at Omnicom, where they were both working at the time, came to me and said, there's this chap and he's got this idea and he needs, and I quote, a little bit of event support. Could you have a chat with him? That was actually the understatement of not just the year, but the understatement of all time, I think, because a little bit of support actually was, how are we going to build this whole thing and get it off the ground? So the remarkable thing about John and that moment in time was that he had got Tim to agree to let him use the Eden Project. And he had about 250 people working on what needs to be the content of this event. What is the agenda? What is it that we need to be talking about when we're thinking about the future quality of life that we want in this country and the quality of our places and so on? And who are the speakers that we need? Who are the people that we need to get together? 250 people were working on that agenda, and he had a venue. And actually that was sort of it. So what we then needed to do was we needed to write a budget. How much was this going to cost? We needed to get some sponsorship. We needed a website and a brand and a mechanism to sell tickets and a structure. And we needed lots of stages and microphones and all of this kit to come into the Eden Project, because Eden Project is not a conference centre. That is not what it was designed for, which is absolutely the beauty of it and why it is fantastic, because we bring people to sit together in a group in the rainforest with, being dripped on with birds running around their feet, to have these kind of big conversations. It's so much more powerful than being in any sort of hotel or conference center. But it did require a little bit of work to make it work. So my job was to work with John, who had this incredible vision and bravery and he would say himself a fair heap of probably naivety at that point in time as to what it was going to take to actually get this off the ground. We had 1,000 people in that first year, 450 speakers, 15 different stages live every hour of every day. That was an extraordinary privilege and an extraordinary experience, because every moment in my life up until that point, the event planning process had started with a purchase order and a budget. Here is how much money you've got to spend, go away and make it happen. Here, there was no purchase order. We had to raise every penny that was going to make it happen. And we had to convince 1,000 people to come and take part in this big, giant national narrative conversation based on absolutely nothing, because we'd never done it before. We had no photographs, no videos, no proof of concept. So it was testament to John's Black Book and his career and his relationships to date to get those people there. And then my ability to actually make it happen and make it work. And by the way, during that time where we were building this thing from scratch, I was running 3 other projects for my actual day job, each of which had a multi-million-pound budget and a client that I was answerable to. And on the side, I was giving John this little bit of event support in quote marks. So that was an interesting time. I'm not going to lie, it nearly killed all of us who were involved. And of course, it wasn't just me and John. There was several other people involved that got us through that experience at that time. But that was a pretty Herculean effort. But my God, it was worth it. And people came And again, I had this experience of seeing what the power of a live event can do, because people came, 1,000 of them came, and they laughed and they cried. And you don't get people going to your average conference and feeling that amount of emotion, that they are laughing and crying as they are taking part in these sessions and these conversations. And it was almost like what we'd provided for people was sort of a relief in some sort of way, or a release, because there was all this worry that they had about the future of this country and their own futures and so on. And suddenly here was a cohort of fellow leaders, because it's predominantly C-suite and chairs and senior people that come and take part in this. And suddenly they realized that there were other people out there who were also thinking the same things, worrying about the same things and so on. So yeah, that was a big one. I guess one thing that also was extraordinary about my meeting John and him having secured the Eden Project as the venue for Anthropy is that actually it was like a full circle moment for me, and a real kind of culmination of everything, because I actually knew Tim when I was a child. So as a complete and utter bizarre random coincidence, my parents were friends with Tim and his wife when they lived in London. Tim was a music producer and they moved down to Cornwall, and we used to go and visit them down there in the summer holidays, or sometimes they would come to Suffolk with us where we used to go on holiday. And I remember Tim turning from music producer he spotted this place called Heligan Gardens, and that was his project before Eden. And I remember my parents going off to look around Heligan Gardens with him before it was actually even his. And I remember that process, and they were colouring in maps at the kitchen table for council planning processes and all of that. And no sooner was Heligan done and sort of open to the public, and the transformation that he'd done there of those gardens was complete, did he have the concept of Eden Project. And I remember being in the pub, and he drew on the back of a napkin this kind of arch, which now we know as being the very famous biomes of the Eden Project, where Anthropy actually takes place. But I remember Tim drawing those biomes, and I remember that journey. I remember going to the pit and seeing it full of bulldozers and trucks and being dug up and converted into what we now know as being the world's largest indoor rainforest. It was a redundant clay pit, originally. And I just wonder whether some of that early exposure in my teenage years to his vision, his drive, him having to raise that money to work with those architects, to persuade people that it was possible to build a rainforest in a clay pit. Maybe that was kind of,
where that drive and where that determination came.
Maybe it was. And I was completely and utterly unaware of it at the time. But I remember those conversations about he'd got £20 million from the bankers and he had to go and find another £20 million from somewhere. Where was that money going to come from? Could he persuade this new thing called the National Lottery? Would they be a partner? And so all of that was, he wasn't having those conversations with me. I was a teenager, but they were going on around me, they were in my background. And I really remember thinking to myself, one day I'd like to be involved in Eden Project. I'd like to maybe go and work there or something, but this is such an incredible project with such an incredible mission. And, Tim was talking about sustainability and climate change decades before most people were talking about climate change. No one was talking about it 30 years ago when I was overhearing some of these conversations. So I just think that's, it's a real sort of full circle thing for me to then have met John, to be putting together Anthropy and to lo and behold discover that it's in the Eden Project, where, that had made such an impression on me as a child.
And you're coming up for, I think it's the 4th of the Anthropy event.
Yes, exactly. 25th to the 27th of March this year.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's going very well. It's still a Herculean effort, but there's now 10 of us in our team, which is, a fantastic development from where we were 4 years ago, where it was John and I and a couple of other very key volunteers. But we're growing the team. We've got huge appetite and interest. We've got 85 member organizations now. We're doubled in size, so about 2,000 people come and take part. And we just hear unanimously all the time how necessary this is and how much people need it. And unfortunately, Dave, in the climate that we're currently in, it's probably actually needed now more than it was at the time, because it began as a COVID initiative. And since then, we've seen increased polarization across the country, many more concerns about the future of democracy and all sorts of things that require us to break down some silos and work together and collaborate actually more now than ever.
And I mean, to anybody listening, I'd give it a ringing endorsement. It's a fantastic event, and you come away totally inspired. You meet amazing people. If you haven't been, you definitely should go. We're coming right to the end of our time now, and we always end with a fun fact, although I'm not sure your fun fact sounds much fun to me, but why don't you share your moment?
Well, the fun fact is a bit of an odd one, really, but that my daughter, my second child, was actually born in the hospital car park, not in the hospital itself, because she was in rather a hurry. So, yeah, that's something a bit different, a bit unusual. My fun fact: I gave birth in the hospital car park.
Did you have to buy a car parking ticket?
Oh, God knows. Probably should have done.
Yeah, no. Well, the way hospitals seem to be charging for everything now, I'm surprised you didn't get a fine or clamped. But that's incredible.
Well, it was the middle of the night.
Oh, okay. No, but that's incredible. I can't imagine what that must have been like. Well, thank you very much for spending the time to talk to Pivot Points and talk to me. That was just absolutely brilliant. And wish you every success with Anthropy. I'm sure it will be amazing. And I'm sorry I can't be there with you this year. I shall miss it greatly. But thank you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pie and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpie.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.